Yo, what's going on guys, Jin here, and I hope you're all having a good start to the year. This video will be updating the previous Mercenary Grenadier build I did, and noting the changes I made heading further into the endgame. It's capable of handling the Temple of Chaos, and the Trials of Sekhmet once you get geared and leveled up reasonably. And of course it's also capable of handling up to at least tier 15 maps, even with non-optimal gear, though some bosses are of course a lot more problematic than others to take down. If you haven't seen the previous version of the build, designed for leveling up, and you're a new player, I'd recommend you check that out first. It'll be linked in the description below. And if you find these videos helpful, leave a like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment if you want. It helps out a lot. So let's start off with the gems. For our first skill, we're going to be using Explosive Grenade. This is going to serve as a lot of fire damage, as well as a detonator for our other skills, helping ignite the oil grenades and explode the poison clouds from gas grenade. We're going to support this with magnified effect, fast forward, which basically reduces the fuse duration on the grenade, and payload, reducing the cooldown of the grenades but allowing it to activate a second time. If you have your 4th and 5th slots, we're going to be using Scatter Shot for 2 additional projectiles. Although it makes the skill deal 20% less damage, those 2 additional projectiles make up for it. It also makes your attack and cast speed a little slower for that supported skill. And we're also going to be using Fire Penetration, so your supported skill will penetrate 30% fire resistance. For our second skill, we're going to be using Flash Grenade. This is what we're going to use to stun and blind enemies, although it can also blind you if you throw it too close to yourself. We're going to support this with Discombobulate, Ruthless, and Heft. As this grenade deals a lot of physical damage, Heft is going to help up the maximum of that. And for the 4th and 5th slots, you're going to be using Overpower and Fire Infusion to gain 25% of the skill's damage as extra fire damage. For our third skill, and our primary damage dealer, I would say, is the Gas Grenade. And we're going to support this with Scatter Shot, Magnified Effect, Payload, Fire Infusion, and Fire Penetration. Alternatively to Fire Penetration, you could also use Elemental Focus. Let's move on to our 4th skill, Oil Grenade, and we're going to support this with Strip Away, Encumbrance, Persistence, and Despoiler. And for the 5th gem, we're going to be using Wildfire. So ignites inflicted by the supported skills spread to other enemies that stay within 1.5 meters for 2 seconds. Alternatively, you could use another movement debilitating gem. For our 5th skill, we're going to be using Cluster Grenade. I like using this as a lead-off skill before you run into a large group of enemies. So we're going to be using Discombobulate with it, Maim, and Encumbrance. And for the 4th and 5th abilities, you can use Soul Thief and Overpower. For our 6th ability, we're going to be using Artillery Ballista. We're mostly using this to buff our damage and our mana regeneration. As you can see, we're supporting it with Ancestral Urgency, Fonts of Mana, which is the mana generation, and Fonts of Rage. Rage grants 1% more attack damage per rage gained, and it stacks up to a maximum of 30. For our 4th and 5th slots, we're going to be using Persistence, so your totems will last 40% longer, and then we're going to be using Overabundance, so supported skills have +1 to limit, so instead of only being able to summon 1 totem, you can summon 2, but your totem will have 50% less skill effect duration, which is kind of balanced out by Persistence. So alternatively to Artillery Ballista, you could use Ripwire Ballista in some situations, and you would use the exact same 5 support gems. Now for our persistent buffs, we're going to be using Herald of Ash, so when we overkill enemies, cause an explosion that will ignite nearby enemies based on the overkill damage dealt. And for the support gems, we're going to be using Clarity, which is the most important one for that mana regeneration, Cannibalism, and Herbalism. For our second persistent buff, we're going to be using Wind Dancer. So this grants you a buff that gives you more evasion per stage of Wind Dancer. It accumulates a stage every 1.3 seconds in my case. and has up to a maximum of 4 stages with 20% quality on your skill gem. So we get extra evasion rating per stage, and on being hit by a melee attack, we consume all stages to trigger Gale Force, which knocks back enemies around you. So really helpful, especially if you get surrounded. This can get you out of a bit of trouble there. And as for the support gem, we're going to be using Precision, so that'll give you a 30% increase in accuracy rating while the supported skill is active. For our third persistent buff, we're going to be using Alchemist Spoon, so this is really handy, especially if you're in a group or having a prolonged boss fight. As you can see, a percentage of recovery from your flasks is also granted to allies in your presence, and it grants you flask charges per second. So in order to use the main 3 buffs, we're going to need 30 spirit each, so that's 90. And to use the main support gems, we're going to need an extra 10 for clarity, so that's 100, an extra 10 for precision, and an extra 15 for cannibalism, and 15 for herbalism. So as long as you have 100 spirit, you can activate Herald of Ash, Wind Dancer, Alchemist Spoon, with clarity on one of them. Alternatively, for a boss fight, you can deactivate Wind Dancer and Herald of Ash, and use Attrition. So you'll mainly be using this for the last part here. You deal 1% more hit damage to rare and unique enemies for every 2 seconds they have ever been in your presence, and that stacks up to 57%, so quite a big damage bonus there. This costs 60 spirit to reserve, so with Clarity and Alchemist Spoon it will cost you 100. And then of course another 20 for Vitality, and then you would use Herbalism, which is another 15. So Alchemist Spoon and Attrition for boss fights, Wind Dancer, Herald of Ash, and Alchemist Spoon for pretty much everything else. For our last ability, we're using Explosive Shot. You don't really use this too often, but it is helpful to have it. You can use this to detonate oil and the poison gas if your explosive grenades happen to be on cooldown or you don't have time to wait for the fuse to go off on your explosive grenade. For the support gems, we're using Martial Tempo, Nimble Reload, and Soul Thief. And for the last 2 slots we're going to be using Blind, and we're going to be using Heft. So that's it for the skills. Next we're going to be going over the passives. This will all be in the build planner in the description below, so if you want to see the full thing, just click on that. The main things we're going to want to get are Volatile Catalyst. We're going to want to get all this 2-handed weapon damage. Of course we're going to get all these grenade abilities, especially cluster bombs for that additional projectile. Volatile grenades to reduce the grenade fuse duration. And then importantly we want to get Polymathy or Polymathy, Repeating Explosives, and Giant Slayer. This gives you a lot of accuracy, damage, and chance to inflict ailment on rares and uniques. We're also going to want to get Crushing Judgment and Authority, as well as Incendiary and Smoke Inhalation. So after we've gone down that way, then we want to work on going out to the left. So we're going to go for Blurred Motion. That gives us attack speed percentage, accuracy percentage, and dexterity percentage. Then from there we're going to go further to the left. We're going to pick up all of these Armor and Blade Catcher. And then we're going to come down here into more 2-handed damage. We're also going to pick up the Strength node here, and Beef, which is a good chunk of strength, worth 5 of the normal nodes. And then we're going to be picking up Crushing Verdict and the precursors to that. Before I forget, basically every free node we have is going to be Strength, unless you need Dexterity to equip your gear or activate Wind Dancer and Alchemist Spoon. And then lastly, I'm going to be working my way up through this armor, Sturdy Metal, which is very, very handy. And we're going to be going up to the Burn Away here for the increased fire damage and penetration. So pretty straightforward there. As for your jewels, you're going to be looking for jewels with increased projectile damage or increased fire damage, increased attack damage, things like that, as well as increased chance to stun, chance to blind, or increased armor, things of that nature. And that will apply for all of your jewels. Next up, for the Ascendancy. For our first 4 points, we're going to be going for the reduced attribute requirements, integrated efficiency, more reduced attribute requirements, and gem studded, so this is what allows you to use 2 copies of the same support gem in different skills, which you can see we used a lot of duplicates. And for the next 4, we're going to be using this attributes, adaptive capability, so attribute requirements of gems can be satisfied by your highest attribute. This allows you to transfer basically all of your nodes into strength, as you won't need the high dexterity required to activate Wind Dancer and to activate Alchemist Boon, which in turn gives you a lot more life thanks to having all of that strength. And for your final 2, you can either go for attributes and enhanced effectiveness, so your inherent bonuses from intelligence, strength and dex are doubled, really handy, or you can go for skill gem quality and crystalline potential. Alternatively, if you don't need adaptive capability, if you've got enough attribute requirements, then you could consider going further up the skill gem quality and into advanced thaumaturgy, which really helps you in the mana department. So that wraps up the Ascendancy passives. Now let's move on to the Atlas skill passives. I'm just going to be going over the main 30 points. So for the main 30 Atlas passives, you're first going to be walking towards Fortunate Path and Constant Crossroads, and then you're going to want to pick up all of the higher tier waystones. This basically gives you a good amount of waystones at a higher tier, so you don't have to really worry about it and you won't run out. After that, you want to work towards the pack sizes, especially Bountiful Bloodlines and Twin Threats. Gives you a lot of extra blue monsters and an extra rare guaranteed. You also want to pick up Expanding Hordes for even more blue monsters. Then you would want to work towards Deadly Evolution, which in turn gives you increased waystone quantity as well. And lastly, Treasure Coves. Pretty straightforward there. Now for the gear. So for the gear, what matters the most for survivability and damage output is of course having a decent amount of armor. At the very least keeping you at 50% or above on damage reduction, and aiming for max resistances, so 75% or more. This makes a huge difference. High evasion goes a long way to improving your effective HP as well. On top of that, you really need a high base damage weapon, and with this build we'll be going for a Bombard Crossbow, Expert preferred. As with this type of weapon, we get an additional projectile for grenade skills. For runes here, we're going to go with Iron runes for the extra damage, but if it's going to be your final weapon, something like the Soul Core of Citaqualotl could be worth holding out for. You want to look for high physical damage percent, preferably with extra physical damage. Also extra fire damage is good too. Then something like attack speed and levels to projectiles, and also mana leech. If you're going for a crit version of the build, then of course crit chance and crit damage are things to look for as well. Next up for the armor pieces, in general, you're going to be looking for a mix of resistances that will keep your total at 75% or higher if possible, as well as good armor and evasion ratings, max life and strength for the max life. For the gloves, you can look for mana leech and life leech on top of those things. And for the boots, you would look for movement speed. As for the rings, after getting your resistances in check, you can look for more physical damage and fire damage, as well as percent increased fire damage and more mana and life leech. For the amulet, you can look for increased mana, increased maximum life, projectile skills, increased armor, and also you can get spirit, and to round it out you can look for damage recouped as life, or damage recouped as mana. As for the type of amulet, Azure and Solar are good options, but I wouldn't really worry too much about that, as long as you get some good stats on it. For the belt, it's just more of the same, resistances, max life, etc. But a belt with built-in implicit flask recharging is great, And additional charm slots are very useful as well. You can use whichever charms suit you the best. Golden charms are good for the item rarity, if you don't need extra defenses. Charms against frozen and lightning have seemed to help me out the most overall. For the chest piece, high armor and armor percent is a big bonus thanks to sturdy metal giving us 80% armor bonus based on our chest piece. And of course you want evasion and evasion percent too if you're using a mixed chest piece. You want to get resistances too, of course. And you want to get spirit here as well, especially if you can't get it on the amulet. That'll let you use those extra support gems on your persistent buffs. Outside of that, iron runes are the most efficient here since it's percentage based, and the chest piece has the highest armor and evasion of all your pieces by far. For the helm, pretty much the same as the chest piece minus the spirit, so instead critical hit chance and something like strength. For the other rune slots on the helm, boots and gloves, just try and max out your resistances, and if they're already maxed, then increase your armor and evasion. Lastly, for the flasks, you want to go for increased amount recovered and gains charges per second for both. Alternatively, instead of gains charges, you can go with increased charges. That pretty much wraps it up for the build thus far. Thanks a lot for watching, hope you learned something and enjoyed. If you want to, leave a like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment. All that good stuff. It really helps out a lot and is much appreciated. Hope to see you in the next video. Bye!